We talked about space-time and Big Bang. Today we're going to deal with this little half of space-time called time. You have space, time. Let's look at time. And before we can get to time, to a definition of time, we need to find out what the history of time is. We got to go back to the days of the Greeks. Maybe they had time before that, but it was calendar time. They were talking about the seasons because they were worried about planting and when the sun was coming back out, and when spring was around the corner, so they could plant and so on. So in that sense, they had time. But an analysis of time, of what time really is, I think the Greeks started that. I don't think there were too many cultures or any culture at all that preceded them in an analysis, a deep analysis of what time is. And you had several Greeks come before Plato, but we can look at Plato directly and start with him. Okay, he wasn't the first guy. Okay, other people dealt like Democritus and so on who came before. They talked about time as well. They just didn't develop it to the degree that Plato and Aristotle are going to do. Are going to do it with. Okay. And so here you have Plato, and he says time, his analysis is that it's the opposite of eternity. Look at his train of thought. He's saying that time is the opposite of eternity. And that's kind of strange in my opinion, because eternity is a question of time. You would think that it belongs under the category of time. In other words, eternity is a time issue. And Plato says, no, these two are exact opposites. Okay, let's find out why. He says, eternity preceded time. So there was this eternity before time came into being. Okay? And so I guess after time, there's going to be another eternity. Okay, I guess he didn't address that. But he says eternity is to one what time is to many. Okay, because time, it only has relevance when you're talking about many. In other words, numbers. And numbers only have relevance in the context of many. If you have only one, well, you don't have numbers. What you have is one number, and maybe not even that, because you have nothing to compare it against. So he's saying time has to do with numbers, and eternity does not really have to do with numbers, but with unity. Okay, and also eternity is like the present. In other words, it's got to do with the verb is, that tense. Okay, whereas time has to do with was and what will be, what was before and what's after. It's like time stops at is, at the present, at now, and that's exactly when the future begins. In other words, with the future time begins its travel. And so where the past ends, that's where the future starts. And it's like, I don't know if there's any amount of time in between, but that's what he's going to call eternity. He calls it the now. Okay, whether it's got an interval, well, that's another issue, because apparently he's saying that time has to do with intervals, but the now, well, what do you mean an interval of now? What are we talking about, when we have now? And you can address that. You can say it's durationless, okay? So time has to do with before and after, okay? So he's got this qualitative notion of time. And of course, once he analyzes that eternity has to do with now, it's the next step is to say the eternity is equal to existence itself. Okay, like he's saying, existence is not a verb in that sense. It's just a snapshot. Okay, that's what exist is, which is a very good approximation to the scientific definition of existence. Okay, of exist. Whereas time is becoming. Time is in motion. Time is numbers. Time is before and after. There's motion in there. Okay. So he says eternity is timelessness, timeless, durationless, changeless. Eternity has no beginning, no end. It's like I say, the alpha, no alpha and no omega. Okay? And he says also, he adds that time is spherical because to him this was a perfect figure. Okay, the sphere, the most perfect figure. And it gives me the notion that he's going around in circles, because a circle in the mind of the mathematician, the deranged mind of the mathematician, a circle is infinite, they say. What do you mean it's infinite? Yeah, because you go around and around and around and you never find an end, find an edge, a surface, something like a wall against which you crash. And again, it's because the mathematical mind never defines these terms and then gets confused in his own semantics. No, that's not called infinite. It's called, incessant walking. We're not talking about the sphere being infinite, but the incessant walking around it being infinite. Really incessant walking, eternal walking. And you can say that about any figure. You can go around, a cube here. You can go around the cube, And I mean, you find an edge there, so what? You can go around it forever. You can do that for any object. You can go around me. So they said nothing. All objects are finite. My surface stops here and then air continues. Okay, air is not part of me. Air is outside of me. Okay, and so this is one of the issues that uh, got them confused because they talked about infinity, and they're saying an object is finite, but it's also infinite, meaning unbounded, as the modern mathematicians, the relativists, call it, unboundedness. No, it's not unbounded. It's incessant walking, and that's not unbounded. It's got nothing to do with the adjective bound. It's got to do with the adverb incessantly. And that's what it's got to do with. And these people confuse it. They have all that language confused. They also confused bending of light versus the deflection of the photon. Deflection is not the same thing as bent or warped. Okay? Deflection is not a banana. Deflection means you change course. Okay? And so these people get confused because they confuse the language, and they take itineraries and they treat them as physical objects, as lines or points or whatever. That's where the problem starts. Okay, so here we have Aristotle. He comes a little later. Remember, he studied at Plato's what is it, academy, and but he had a different notion of what time is, or he thought he did, and I think he did. Okay, says, does it belong? He asks these couple of questions. That's what he's going to try to answer. He says, does it belong to the class of things that exist, or to that of things that do not exist? Well, there the issue is he never defined the word exist. And so because he didn't figure that out, he never figured out that only things can exist and time is not a thing. And so you cannot talk about the existence of time. If he would have figured that out, he wouldn't have written so much nonsense in his book 4. Okay. Anyways, he says, what is its nature? In other words, how are we going to define time? That's what he wanted to get a handle on. Okay. And he's going to define it a little different than Plato. Okay. He says time is present equally everywhere and with all things. This is his train of thought. Okay. This is how he's going to proceed with all this. Time is continuous. And what he meant by continuous is the opposite of what continuous means in physics. Okay, in the religion of mathematics, continuous means segmented, divisible, means that you can chop it into pieces. That's what continuous means to them. That's what it meant to Aristotle, and that's not what continuous is. Continuous, in a physical sense, is something made of a single piece. That's what continuous means. Okay, so his notion of continuous is divisible. That it's divisible, then it's continuous. Okay. And so he says, it's because time is like the number line, and it's chopped into all these numbers and all these little pieces. So he says time is like a number line, essentially, that it's continuous. Okay. Then he says time is neither fast nor slow. Okay. But many or few, long or short. In other words, you don't have fast or slow time. Time's always marks at the same pace. It's not like speed. Speed you can go faster, you can go slower, but time, time goes always at the same pace. That's what he's saying. It's like assuming the second is the unit, right? The second has always the same length of duration, same length of time. Okay, so he's saying it never goes faster or slower. Okay, this is his reasoning. He says you got to talk about it in terms of many and few, or long or short. Okay, and again, when he talks about long or short, he doesn't realize that he is essentially contradicting that it's fast or slow, because that's what long or short means. Long or short, what are you talking about? You're talking about duration. Okay, that's what. Okay, he said time does not exist without change or movement. Well, I would stop him at the first predicate there. Time does not exist, period, because it's not a physical object. But see, when you start talking about the existence of concepts, that's when you get into the semantic, rabbit hole, and that's where he fell. Okay, so he says without change or movement, time is a measure of motion. This is going to be his definition of time. He says time is not motion. Time is a measure of motion. What does he mean by that? He means he's gonna measure time, and he's gonna assign a number to it, like with a unit, like 3 seconds. So 3 seconds is time. It's not just motion. It's how much time it took, which means what number do I assign to that motion? Well, I can assign speed to it, and I can assign other things. But in the context of time, I'm going to say, well, it's 3 seconds. And so that's the part that he says is time, and not just the motion, which is perhaps like before and after, which was essentially Plato's argument. No, he's saying, no, you got to put a number to that. Without a number, you don't have time. And so he says time is not movement, but movement insofar as it admits enumeration. Okay? Time is what is counted. Okay? You have to count time. Okay? And time is number of movement in respect to the before and after. In other words, time is not before and after. It's when you assign a number to before and after. Okay, so this is a little bit of difference between Plato and him. Okay, where did all this come from? A lot of this had to do with the Greeks were treating a subject which is really at the root of physics. They really were dealing with a subject matter that I call it the foundations of physics. They were trying to figure out, what space is, what an object is, what time is, what motion is. They were trying to define these terms. They were trying to get a notion of these things. And you have people like Parmenides, who is famous for saying that there is no motion. And you say, what do you mean there is no motion? Here, there's motion. You say there is no motion. But you got to put it in the right context. What were they talking about? Well, the debate, Parmenides, by the way, preceded Aristotle and Plato, okay? But what were they talking about? They were talking about the origin of the universe. How did matter, in our terms today, how did things come into being? What was there before things came into being? What are we talking about, Big Bang here? What came before the Big Bang? They had already these questions, among the Greeks, ancient Greeks. And so they were trying to figure out how something came into being. And Parmenides was saying something cannot come into being. This was his notion. Because then you have change, then you have motion, then you have time. But he could not explain how something can come into being in his mind. That was one issue. And so he says, then is no motion, because then you would have to have motion in order for something to come into being. That was one aspect of it. The other aspect that they debated was space. Is there such a thing as space? Empty space, nothingness, vacuum. And the Greeks pretty much all, I think, agreed to a great extent, or I can't say all of them, but I'd say most of them, thought that there was no such thing as empty space. There was always something there. And so the only issue was whether a physical object such as my hand, right, displaced whatever was already there. And they said, well, here you have space. Well, here we have air, and they did accept the air. But they said, is there such a thing as empty space? And they say, no, there's no such thing as empty space because it's taken up here by air. And that's all they knew about. So they said, no, there's always something. And in this case, there's air. And I guess they realized they couldn't see it, but they said, it's like I can touch it. And so when I move my hand, I'm pushing air. So Aristotle was of the idea that there is motion, but the motion of my hand of something that we can see, touch, verify, etc., is displacing air which occupied that space and now no longer occupies it. And Parmenides was saying, well, how can you move something if everything is everywhere? How can there possibly be motion of your hand, if everything is taken up? What are you displacing? Like if he looked at it more or less as when you look at a sandbox. The little ball doesn't move in the sandbox because there's all these grains of sand. What would compel it to move? So these were the issues that they were debating. It had to do with the origin of the universe, with the nature of space. And in that context, that's when they're going to bring in the word time. They're going to analyze time, especially Aristotle. He's going to do a little bit of analysis on time. Okay. Anyways, here's the issue that I think they all missed. Okay. I talked about this a little bit the other day, and it's got to do with, if they had this notion of air, and at least Democritus had the idea that we had a whole bunch of atoms everywhere. Okay. The question is, what surrounded each atom? What gave shape to each ball, each atom, each little thing out there that forms the ether, the air, the whatever is around us. Okay, and so here's the little ball. Here's the one particle. That's the only particle that God made. Okay, and so the question is, what's the black stuff that gives shape to that ball? Because otherwise the ball would not have shape. If we could remove all that black stuff, turn it into white, then what would be the shape of the whiteness? The only way you can conceptualize the particle, the thing, the atom, is if you have something around it. And here you have, several particles, and they're separated one from another. And so the question here again is, what separates each one of these particles, each one of these grains of sand? Each one is finite. Obviously, you can pick up a grain of sand and put it in your hand. You say, well, this one's different than all the others. So what's between two grains of sand? That's the question. Again, what's the black stuff? That's what we want to understand. And they never understood that the black stuff is chiseling separation between the grains of sand. I don't know if that question ever popped in their minds really, because you don't see it in there. You don't see it in Aristotle's analysis. You would think that he would have addressed that issue. He didn't. He just said, we have all these particles, and when our hand moves, the particles move out. We occupy the space that the particles were in. Okay, it never occurred to him that the particles themselves, if that's what he was pushing, right? Obviously, the hand is different than the air. He probably assumed that there were a lot of particles in there. And the question is, what surrounds each particle? What gives discreteness to each particle? That's the question that they missed. I didn't see it analyzed anyways, never from Aristotle. And if you say, well, the black stuff is a thing, which is what a lot of people thought over the ages, and they still do, like quantum mechanics, general relativity, string theory, they all treat space as a physical object, as a thing. Okay, and what is a thing? Well, under our definition, it's that which has shape. So you have to tell me what the shape of space is. So you can say, well, the white things are separated by this thing called space, nothingness, vacuum, which is made out of particles itself. Okay, great, it's a thing. Okay, then you got to tell me what, if it's a thing, if it has shape, right? What surrounds the black stuff? And in other words, you got to tell me what that other white stuff is now that surrounds, what's in the black part. At some point you got to stop. The buck has to stop somewhere. You can't continue saying, well, space is a physical object. Okay, what surrounds it? Well, the fourth dimension. Is that a physical? Yeah, it's a physical object. What surrounds it? And you can't just keep pushing, the buck. At some point, you got to have a nothing, not a something. Because if you have a something, something's got to give it shape. So at some point, you have to have a nothing. And we don't have to go more than one step. Space is the nothing that surrounds all objects, that chisels shape. Okay? And so they missed that point. And because they missed that point, they got into a lot of arguments in circles. Okay? They went in circles. What was the ideal shape of the circle, the sphere? They went around in circles. Okay, a few centuries later, a couple of centuries, more like 6, 7 centuries later, we have this fellow, St. Augustine. And he was a religious man, okay? That's why he's a saint, okay? And he asked the question, he read Aristotle, okay? And he said, what then is time? He wanted to know what time is. And he says, if no one asks me, I know what it is. Intuitive feel for what time is, okay? Something passing, He had an idea, but he couldn't explain it. He said, but if I wish to explain it to him who asks, I do not know. In other words, he had no definition. He had no explanation for time. He had no idea what time is. He said, I know what it is. It's like, I know what porn is, but I can't define it. And this guy's more or less the same thing. He says, I know what time is, but I can't define it. I can't tell you what time is. Because you had no idea. And this is after, we're talking about 600 years after Aristotle, 700 years after Plato. I mean, he had no idea. Okay, so if the present were perpetually present, this is what he says, okay, this is his reasoning, there would be no time. Okay, in other words, again, he's saying that the now, eternity, what is eternity? The now. But the now is not a duration, because he says if it's permanently there, if the present were permanently there, there would be no time. The only way you can conceptualize time, again, bringing a little bit of Plato, a little bit of Aristotle here, he said the only way you can conceptualize time, okay, eternity or no time, okay, which again it was the definition of Plato, is if you have all this past just meeting with the future, okay, where they meet, we call that the present, the now, durationless, okay, and that's eternity. So essentially he was saying the same thing that these other two folks had. He made no progress on that. The important ingredient I think that Augustine introduces here is the notion that God is the God of time and that God is outside of time. God creates time, but he's outside of it. Okay, this is the notion he's going to put in there, and this is going to be used by just about everyone after that, especially all religious folks. And people in in general relativity primarily, which are, in my opinion, they're religious folk as well. They call themselves atheists, but they're religious people because they believe in the same stuff. They have the same arguments. Okay? And so he says, for the present to belong to time, it must pass. Because if the present stays there, we don't have time. What we have is eternity, which is what Plato said. The present is an instant of time that cannot further be divided, durationless. Okay? Okay, so this is what he continues with. He writes this, again, brings God into the picture because he's trying to show that God is outside of time? Because people ask the questions, and this was a theological question, and the question was, what happened before? What was God doing before He created time? What happened before then? And so they had to get a theory, an explanation for that issue, because lots of people were asking those questions. And so he says, "You, O Lord, made that very time, and so time could pass by before you made those times." Okay? But if there was no time before heaven and earth, why do they ask what you did then? There was no then, where there was no time. Okay, so time, he says, started when God made the universe, man, whatever. God dwells in the sublimity of an ever-present eternity. So God is in that eternity, in that now, and we are in time, but God is outside of time. So this was the explanation they gave, and to this day they give this explanation to the flocks, okay, out there. They say, God is outside of them, because you say, well, if God's outside, if God created the universe, what was He doing before that? And for how long was that before? Was it an eternity until He decided one day, scratch his head, and decided to create man and the universe and time? And they said there was no time before that. Well, what do you mean by that? For this, you would have to define time so that it would have meaning. But if you don't define the word time, and what did Augustine say? He doesn't know what time is. He can't define it. He can't tell you what it is. Well, if he cannot tell me what it is, how can he say that God is outside of time, that God is in the present eternity, okay, in the now, in durationless now, and He's outside of time? How can you say that if you don't know what time is, if you haven't defined the word time? See, in our case, it's very easy. We define the word time, and then we can use it consistently. We know what we're talking about. And we don't use time in science. We have no use for the word time. We do not use time because you cannot explain absolutely anything with the word time, and we don't need time to explain anything. That's why we have no use for time. We have no use for seconds. We have no use for minutes, hours, months, weeks, years. We have no use for any of that. Not when you're explaining a mechanism. If I want to explain what caused this pencil to fall to the floor, to the desk in this case, what do I need time for? I'm not going to give you a rate. I'm not going to tell you how fast it went. I need to explain to you the mechanism, what brings it down, what compels the pencil to fall down. For that, I don't need time at all. And if I'm going to explain magnetism, how it is that one magnet attracts another, I don't need to know how fast it went to explain to you the mechanism. And other than that, I'm not sure you would have to tell me what you need time for in science, in physics, to explain something. So again, if he's going to explain that God is outside of time, first you got to define time. And if we say, well, time is a comparison of two motions, well, God cannot be without time, even outside of the universe. Why? Because as soon as God moves an arm, a hand, or his magic wand, I'll act the part of God right now, okay? And so I'm going to create the universe. I'm God. I'm creating the universe. I have to wave that magic wand. Okay, how else, without any motion whatsoever, how can God create anything? What do you mean by create? Create, you have to have some motion at least. And if you have some motion, you have time, because now you have a comparison of two movements. He's comparing, movement of his hand against his what's happening in his brain, or his eyes, or his feet, his nose. He's got movements all over his body. Even if he's the only guy in the universe, there's got to be more than two motions in his entire body. And that's if God is a thing. If God is a nothing, well, all bets are off. Then you can't talk about existence or creation or anything. But if God is a being, as he's taken, at least in most religions, these Christian religions, then there's got to be at least two motions when he creates anything. For example, the universe, man. I mean, he according to the Bible, he took some clay and built man out of that. Well, right now he's got a billion motions there to compare. And so if he's going to do all these motions, he is part of time. He can't say I'm outside of time. Yeah? Aren't you moving with respect to your creation right now, this very minute? I mean, there's got to be a distance between my nose and God's nose. Okay? There's got to be distance between my finger and God. Okay? Distance between my finger and God. He can hide in the 10th dimension if he wants. It doesn't matter. There's got to be a direct line of distance from my finger to him. And so I can move God very easily, because what is motion? Motion is change in location. Well, here I'm moving God right now. God is moving, whether he likes it or not, with respect to my finger. Distance is changing constantly between my finger and him. So God is moving right there. And if there's motion, you've got time. You need two motions, but it's unavoidable to have two motions when you have a being like us, like humans. God is a being like us, created in our image, or vice versa. Then obviously God has more than one motion. If he has more than one motion, he has time. He can't avoid time. Okay, so first you got to define time, then you can use the word time consistently, rationally. But if you say God is outside of time, what does that mean? I mean, if you haven't defined time. And so, yeah, it turns out that the ideas that Augustine had are very similar to general relativity. Rings a bell? Here, these people say the same thing. There's no time outside of space-time. Space-time is that beer glass that's tilted there, okay? And time is what you see on the horizontal axis there, okay? And so there is no time above, below, before, or after space-time. Space-time, that glass there, it contains time in it. Space and time and motion and objects, everything is contained within that. There is no black stuff outside of the glass there. So all that black stuff is artificial that I put in there and that other people put in there. You got to define what that black stuff is. To draw a bottle there and say this is space-time, we need to know what's outside of space-time. What's it pushing against? What is it growing against? And they say that's an unscientific question, partly because they have no way of proving it. And the issue is that you don't prove this. It's a conceptual issue. You have to answer that question. Avoiding it simply destroys your religion. That's all it is. And so, yeah, there is no time outside of space-time in the religion of general relativity. And that's essentially what Augustine was saying. He's saying outside of God, or where God dwells, there is no time. What is time, Augustine? Please tell me so that I know what you're talking about. How can God be outside of time if I just proved to you that if I move my finger, I'm moving God, and God has to have more than one motion, because if he's got a hand over here and another hand over there, my finger is moving with respect to his two hands, his eyes, his belly button. I'm moving God constantly, and we got a comparison of motions there. And you got a comparison of motion, you got time. Okay? So, God, this eternity thing, this eternal, forever, saying that's the opposite of time, like Plato did. No. There's no such monster. Eternity is part of time. It's part of the concept of time, because eternity is nothing in a sense. It's got no real definition other than in the context of time. And if time is a comparison of two motions, what is eternity? It's just incessant comparison of two motions. That's all that eternity is. Okay. Anyways, here we have a couple centuries after, few centuries, 6, 7 centuries after Augustine. Now we have St. Anselm, and he was from Canterbury, okay? And he's the guy who came up with the block universe, more or less along the lines of Augustine. Again, he says all time essentially is equally existent. The block universe that general relativity has, that's essentially comes from St. Anselm. And you could even take it all the way to Augustine. He had more or less the same notion. It's Anselm who's going to put it in a more proper format. And so he says all time is equally present in God's eternity, okay? Since it is God's eternal activity which causes it to be. Okay? So God sees the past, present, and future. God's outside of time, but he can see it all there. Our time, not God's time, So, Anselm says God is outside of time, also like Augustine. And I guess, one copied essentially from the other, maybe developed it a little further. And again, it was all related to creation. What happened before creation? Was time, was God living forever or what? And says, no, there is no forever, because there is no time in God's world. Time is in our universe, in the universe he created, in the little glass, tilted glass that general relativity says, not outside of it. Okay, so it's the same concept, same notion. And here, a couple centuries later, we have St. Thomas Aquinas, and he says the same thing, more or less. They're all in the same boat here, because they're all trying to, again, explain creation and have some kind of explanation, rational explanation in their minds for how things came to be and what happened before things came to be. How did existence come into existence, essentially? And he says God lives in the nunc stands that now that stands still. That's where God dwells. Okay, God is in the now that stands still. There's no duration. There's nothing happening. I don't know how, how can it stand still if God is moving? What is God, a rock? I mean, God has to be moving if God is a being, I mean, especially if he created us in his image, he better be, with arms, legs, eyes. So he's got to be moving. Hopefully he's moving. How did he create man if he didn't move at least one finger? Especially if he molded man out of clay, he's got to be moving. If he moves, he's in trouble already because he's he's within the bounds of time. He can't say he's outside of time. He's already in time. Sorry, So he cannot talk about the now and the now being eternal because the now, as we will see, there is no such thing as the now. Okay, as there is no such thing as the past or the future. Okay, that's why we don't use time either in science. We have no use for the word time. We're just trying to make sense of what how it relates to relativity. That's the context, okay, of all this space, time. Okay, God neither learns nor forgets. He knows it all, I guess. Okay, but grasps all things in one infinite, perfect, and unchanging net of knowing and understanding. God knows it all. He knows the future, the past, because he's got it all there in front of him. Time is only in that little train set that he's got in his living room. Time is only in there, moving in there. God is outside of time. He's not part of that little train set. Okay? He's not moving on the rails, none of that. That's us. Okay? All things are therefore present to him. He lives in the present. We live in the past and in the future, but he lives in the present. I thought it was the other way around. I thought we lived in the present, so to speak, in the now, and that there is no past and no future because the past is already gone, the future hasn't arrived, so where are we? Well, we're in existence, and existence is the now, the real now, and that's a single frame in the universal movie. Okay, that's a single frame. That's existence. Okay, what you see in a single frame. You take a snapshot of the entire universe. Okay, we could freeze it right there and then. That's eternity, one, and that's also existence. So existence is eternity, yes, but only under those conditions. Okay, but then when you talk about time, what are we talking about? Well, you're talking about the past becoming the future. Right there on that fine line is a single frame. That's the frame of existence, and yes, it has no duration. Okay, but then you got to define these terms in order to talk sensibly with them. Okay, he says all things are therefore present to him. He lives in the present and now, not in the past that he has to dredge up from memory. Like, oh, what happened in the past? He doesn't have to do that because he's already thinking of everything right there in front of him, the past, present, and future. So he doesn't have to rely on memory. Okay, the memory is also there in the present. Okay, nor in the future that he has to anticipate. Okay, so yeah, all these people had more or less the same notion that God lives in the present. Present has no duration. God lives in that present, which is eternity, which is simply existence. There is no time in a now. Okay, it's such a thin line that it has no duration. It's got no width, no length, no height, nothing. It's just a cross section. In other words, like I say, it's a one frame of the universal movie. That's all it is. And supposedly God lives in that one frame, in a picture, in a frozen image. That's our dear God. So he doesn't move because he's there like that. And so he doesn't move. The only way he can move is if he can go to the next frame. Then if you have a series of frames, then you can imagine motion, and then you can imagine time as well. But if you're stuck in one frame of the film, what motion is there? And they say God's in there, but we're in the movie. So we're in a movie that moves. God created us, but God created us without any motion because he's eternal, because he's in the now, and the now has no duration. That's the theory. That's what these people are saying. Okay, from there we're going to move on to Mr. Newton. Okay, he comes in a couple centuries later and he says in his Scholium, this is from his famous Principia book, okay, the introduction to it. And he goes in there and, I mean, you would think this fellow, he's the so-called scientist. Remember, this is the so-called scientific revolution of the 17th century. Even though Newton was an alchemist, he was trying to produce gold, I guess, in his dark basement. And he said, I do not define time, blah, 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 as being well known to all. So he's not going to define time. He's not going to define motion either, but he's credited with inventing the three laws of motion. But he doesn't define time, which he uses in his equations, either under acceleration or under the distance traveled. Okay, so in his equations, he's got to put time in there, right? And But he says he's not going to define time. So that's a poor way to start his book. It's like at that point you should close the book, not read the rest of it, because he's already shot his foot. Okay, he's saying he's not going to define time, but he's going to put time in every one of his equations. And then he gets this notion. He says absolute true and mathematical time flows. Talking about time flowing. And since then we've had this time flowing. Maybe he wasn't the first one, but he puts it in there, so that's one of the sources for the notion that people have today that time flows. Again, it's like electricity, the electrons flow. And you say the electrons are going from atom to atom. Is that what electricity is? And that's when, they pull back because they realize they have to do it with the planetary model of the atom. So yeah, electricity doesn't flow. And you can't say if electricity is the flow of electrons, you can't say electricity flows, because then you're saying the flow of flows. And here we have the same thing. We have time flows. I thought time had already included or includes flow. And this guy says that the flow flows. Okay. And he says, and by any other name is called duration. Then relative time, he says, is a measure of duration by the means of motion. Again, he's got this notion that Aristotle had, that you have to put a number to motion in order for it to become time. But the key issue here is that Newton had this notion that the universe had this absolute time, that there was this thing called time in the universe, okay, that moved or flowed irrespective of what you do. Like, you come and go, you're born, you die, but time always continues. So it's like time is outside of us. Time is universal, absolute. Okay? Instead, Leibniz, his counterpart in those days, he had this notion that they have today, that time was really relative. Okay, that it was more related to objects and not a universal thingy, concept, something going on out there, irrespective of the objects that move here on Earth, especially. And this debate, or this notion, was taken up by people a little later, a century later. First one was David Hume, and his time is the manner in which ideas, impressions, and objects appear to the mind, a manner which is successive. One thing right after another, okay? Time is nothing but the manner in which some real objects exist. Exist, I thought existence was the opposite of time. Existence is eternity, one frame in the movie, no duration. And David Hume, I don't know if he realized it or not, he was saying, it's the condition, the manner in which something exists, that's what time is. And so it's kind of weird, because like now they're backtracking, going back and forth. And I'm sure Hume had read Newton, read Augustine, read Aristotle, but he concludes that it's got something to do with existence. And you would think that existence is timeless, because existence is what is in a single frame of the universal movie. That's existence. Okay, so if you have a single frame, there is no duration. You have a photograph there, timelessness. Okay, and he's saying it's got something to do with existence. Okay, and here's a fellow came just a couple decades later. His name is Immanuel Kant, and he says, he asks this question rhetorically. Now, what are space and time? Are they actual entities? Are they only determinations, or also relations of things? Okay, now, again, is there absolute or is it relative? Okay, this is where the relativistic notion starts coming into view. Okay, that's going to take off at the end of the 19th century, beginning of the 20th. Okay, so this is more or less the origin, the debates or the discussions that were carried out in the old continent in the 18th century. Okay, are they actual entities, space and time? Are they things? Okay, I mean, what is he talking about? Space is a thing, time is a thing. Are they only determinations or also relations of things, but still such as would belong to them even if they were not intuited? Or are they each that they belong only to the form of intuition? Again, borrowing a little bit from Hume, okay? And therefore to the subjective constitution of our mind. I think he was realizing that memory plays a role in the definition of the word time. Okay, that's, I think, what was going through his mind. Okay, without which these predicates could not be ascribed to any things at all. The absolutist, again, he was looking at Newton here, contends that space and time subsist on their own, You die, time continues, right? More or less, independently of objects. The relationalist, relativist today, relationalist, contends that space and time inhere in the objects. Okay, that is, they do not exist independently of them. Okay? And so, which is true? Is time something relative to objects, or is time absolute? Is there a time flowing in the universe, so to speak? Okay? Is there a flow out there? A flow of flows? Okay, and so this is how he answers this, more or less. This is his train of thought. He says different times are successive, different spaces are coexistent. You know, you can have objects simultaneously at the same time, different spaces, different locations, different positions, but you cannot have that with time. Time is like successive, one right after another. You can't have the same time at the same time. Okay? Can't think of a phenomena as unconnected with time, but can present to ourselves time void of phenomena. Okay? This is the absolutist notion. Okay? You have a phenomenon, but he's saying that you can conceptualize time without having a phenomenon. And I'd like to see him try that. I'm saying that that can't be done, but this is what he concluded. He says phenomena can be annihilated in thought. Time cannot. Okay? So he says that somehow time, and again, he's looking at the absolutist notion here, okay? But time is out there, and he says that it can be void of phenomena. I'm not sure how that can be because time is related to phenomena. Okay, you can't have time without phenomena, but this is the absolutist notion. Then he says change of place. Okay, talking about location, position. Okay, or space. You occupy a different space, more or less, like Aristotle said, is possible only through and in representation of time. Okay, so again, this is the notion both Plato and Aristotle had, but Aristotle is going to put a number to that. That's what he's saying that time is. And then he continues, the world must have a beginning in time, else an eternity would have already passed. And then at the same time, he said the world can't have had a beginning because it implies a period of empty time before the world came into being. And you can't distinguish one empty time from another. Okay? So he doesn't resolve the issue. He just says, you can't explain the beginning of the world because then there would be an infinite amount of time before that, and you cannot explain, the either the beginning or the eternal, the eternity of time. You cannot imagine either one. And so he goes into, this is more or less his conclusion. He says, time is a what? Pure form of the sensuous intuition, whatever that means. Different times are just parts of one and the same time. Okay? So he doesn't have really a good definition, anything you can sink your teeth into. All these people essentially had no idea what time is, and they just, gave opinions, and in most cases, they just said what time ain't. Said, no, that's not time. Okay, what is time? Oh, I don't know, but what you just said is not time. That's more or less how all these people were dealing with that. Okay, so what are the conclusions for this segment? Okay, no one defined time from the time of before Christ, 200, 300, 400 years before Christ, all the way to the 18th century. No one had a definition of time throughout this entire period. They gave it their best shot, but they couldn't figure out what time is. They could not give you a definition of time. Okay, and they give you a garbled, this is what time is, but you can't use that, not in physics at least, and I'm not even sure you can use it in mathematics. They just said, well, we don't know what time is, but we're going to use the seconds, the minutes, and the hours, whatever those are. Okay, and then again, most of these people just stated what time is not. They were essentially trying to put down the other guy's notion of time and say, no, that's not time. Well, what is time? I don't know either, but what you said is not time. So all they had were these opinions where one guy was pointing his finger at another. Then related time, they all related time to math, to equations, to measurement, because that's what the mathematicians were going to use. Okay. Again, in physics, we have no use for time. We cannot explain a single phenomenon, a single mechanism, by bringing seconds, minutes, hours, or time in any way, shape, or form. I don't know, before and after, I'm not sure what that would explain. That would be a qualifier like after the fact. Before, this is what happened, and this is what happened after, but you don't need the before and after either. You just explain the mechanism. Okay? And so, yeah, when they introduced math, when they introduced measurement, when they started saying, well, how much time? Well, those are what they could put in the equation. They thrived on that. So that's how time became so powerful in the world of mathematical physics. Okay? And so they, most of these guys, at least throughout most of this period, they introduced God. Okay, why? Because they had to explain the origin of the world, creation. They had to explain why we're here, how did we come here, and what happened before we were here, before God created us. They had to answer that question. That's why they started analyzing time, because that was the context in which the word time arose as an important issue to answer. You had to answer that question because people kept asking, what was God doing before he created us? And they said, well, don't worry about that, because see, time is in God's hands, not outside of him. Okay? And then they had this debate about the absolute against the relative time. Was time related to objects that we see there? Is it two motions there, as I say, with memory, right? Or is time something that flows universally, that even if you die, time continues? Is time some thingy out there, some ghost that pervades the universe? So again, these were the notions that were important in these debaters, these theorists. Okay, what do I say? Very simple. What does Bill say? He says time comparison of two motions. What is time? What have we been doing all these centuries? What we've been comparing, and we'll put it in today's terms. What you're really comparing is, the ticks on your clock. The seconds move, right? The second hand moves around your watch. Okay, and what are we measuring? Well, we're comparing that motion, because you can take all the ticks out, all that stuff. All you know is you have this motion of the second hand or the minute hand or the hour hand, and you're comparing that against the motion of the earth around the sun. You're comparing two motions. That's what time is. Okay, and so once you have that, then you can use it consistently, because now you know what time is. You know what the definition of the word time is. That's the issue. And so once you have that definition, you can talk rationally using the word time. And again, we have no use for it in physics, but we're saying that we need to define the word time if we're going to talk about time. We're going to introduce it, at least in mathematics, let alone in physics. If you're going to introduce it in physics, you had better define the word time. And I'm saying we have no use for time, but what is time? What has it been all these centuries? Well, it's just a comparison of two motions. And for that, you need memory. You need to memorize the initial locations of these two motions, these two objects that are moving, these two things that you are going to reference. You're going to relate one to the other. And once you make the comparison, then you have 1 second, 1 minute, 1 hour, because that's all that 1 second, 1 minute, 1 hour is. It's what is 1 second? 1 second is a tick on your watch, the movement of the second hand from one tick to another. What have you measured? 30 kilometers that the earth went around the sun. That's a comparison. You're comparing two motions. And that's how simple it was. And we have no use for it, but that's the definition of time. If you've got a better definition, bring it on. And it had better be rational. You should be able to use it consistently, and you should be able to address all the issues that I addressed today.